Before I say much more, I want to kind of let you know just some of the folks who've been an influence to me. This week, I started reading a new book called Awe, A-W-E, and I am enthralled by it. I can't put it down, and I would encourage you to consider it. The writer's name is Tripp, and you can find it at Lifeway or anywhere else. It's just about worship, but not worship music. He talks very little bit about in the worship gathering worship. He's talking about worship Monday to Saturday, what worship looks like, and what it really means to be in awe of God all the time. And each chapter, they're just little short 4 or 5 page chapters about what it's like to worship the Lord when you wake up in the morning, and what it's like to worship the Lord when you go to bed at night and do your job and are married to your spouse and raise your children, and what worship looks like. And it's a great little thing for you to consider. I'm also presently listening to a sermon series from a church called Church in the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama, and Pastor Chris there's done just a great job teaching me through this. And you may hear some of the things he said, I may say back to you, because he's been a great influence to me. So grab your Bibles if you would. You want to open to Romans chapter 1. I want you to know something. We are all worshipers. We are all worshipers. We worship something. Everybody worships something. At all times, all of us are worshiping something. Now, the challenge is for us to figure out what it is that we're worshiping and make sure that we're worshiping the thing we're supposed to be worshiping. Now, we'll talk about worship. Worship is, just to give you a kind of a definition of what is worship. Worship is a response to what we value. What's the last word? It's a really important word. Most. You guys talk to me today, okay? Worship is a response to what we value most. Now, this is important for us to get, because we are going to have lots of responses to things that we value. Lots of responses to things that we value. I don't know about you, I have lots of things that I value. Lots of things. For instance, before there was one in this area, I remember when I would see a Starbucks. I was like, yes. And it really didn't matter if I wanted coffee. All of a sudden, I wanted coffee. And so I would go to a Starbucks. Now there's one in town. I don't really go there very often. But, when it was something I didn't get very often, I valued it. The same thing is true with a Krispy Kreme hot sign, and you know what I'm talking about. It could be 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you just had lunch at 2, and the Krispy Kreme hot sign is on, and some of you are like, they don't have those in Paducah. I think I need to probably stop and do that. Okay, that's not worship, but that is a response to something you value, okay? This afternoon, some of us will be watching television, and there will probably be responses, okay? We'll get loud, and we'll, at least one person in this room has like a foam brick that you bought so that you could throw it at the TV and not break your TV. Like, I understand there'll be lots of things like that going on. Okay, that's a response to something we value, but it's not worship unless we value it. What's the last word? Most. That's important. Because you see, life is oftentimes the shuffling of what we value most. And you will find yourself valuing Jesus most today, and valuing Jesus most tomorrow, and valuing Jesus most on Tuesday, and valuing Jesus most on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, but then something might adjust or happen or change, whether it's misunderstanding or brokenness or sin, and all of a sudden you might wake up one day and realize you're right in the middle of responding to something else that you for that moment have valued more than Jesus. That's important that we not lose track of the fact that can happen to and will happen to all of us. So worship is a response to what we value most. You see, I don't think God minds us having things that excite us. I don't think God minds that you went out and bought a jersey this week for a team in Denver or a team in the Carolinas, even though you're never going to wear that jersey, very often, because you don't normally care about either of those two teams. But today it matters, so you went out and you got one. Hopefully you got the off-brand and you didn't pay full price, but you went and got one. I don't think God cares one bit about the fact that you did that, as long as we don't allow those things that excite us to become the thing that excites us most. You understand what I'm saying? And so this is important for us to get. So we're going to walk through this and just consider some things today. You see, we often worship God and value Him. And then there are a lot of other times in our life when we will value God and give homage to God, but not in the way that you worship the thing that is most important. And so we will find ourselves back and forth between obeying God because there are other things that are also important to us. And sometimes following Jesus and worshiping Him causes us to devalue something that we value. And it's in those moments you will know whether or not God is the one you're worshiping. When all of a sudden, in order to do what God told you to do means you don't get to do this other thing you really would like to do, but you decide, I think I'm going to do the thing that I would really like to do instead of doing what God said I needed to do, all of a sudden you've just shifted your most. You got me? You shifted your most. You can only worship the thing that you value most in this world and in this life. And so we're going to look at the Scriptures and see what's going on. I find that a lot of times what happens is that whatever it is that we worship, whatever's most valuable, becomes something that we're obsessed with. We think about it all the time. We read about it. We memorize things about it. We spend our time talking to other people about the thing that we worship, and then all of a sudden we begin to imitate that thing. And before you know it, we start to look like that thing and act like that thing and become that thing. If you don't watch out, you'll find out that you're not worshiping Jesus, because you're becoming a lot like something else. We're going to talk a lot about that today. So in the long run, there are a lot of things in America that people exchange or put in that place of most high. I think I do it. I think you do it. I think people in our country do it. Some do it all the time. Some do it momentarily. Some might only do it occasionally. But we find ourselves exchanging these things. Romans 1:21 says this. Let's read what Paul wrote. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God, nor gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged. That's an important word, exchanged. In other words, take the thing that was most important and trade it in for something that now is most important. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. And now, in their time, in this time this is written a few thousand years ago, there were lots of different kind of false gods. And in that day and age, one of the interesting things was that the false gods would basically say, I'm a false god. And so you have false god salesmen. Now, they wouldn't call them false gods, but they would have little statues, and they would say, hey, if you'll pray to this, it'll make you happy. You know, if you'll buy this and set it near your door, it'll make you prosperous. We'll do all these different things, all of these. And so it was pretty obvious. You'd go, okay, that's a statue of a lizard that I'm supposed to pray to. Okay, that's a false god. Okay, that's obvious. That's a statue of a pregnant woman. I mean, if I pray to that, then my wife will get pregnant. That must mean, okay, that's a false god. So they were fairly obvious. But let me tell you how tricky Satan has gotten in our world. No longer do the greatest idols in our world look like wooden statues of snakes and birds and reptiles. No, no, no. Now the greatest idols in America are almost always connected to Christianity. So before you know it, the Jesus that we follow is not the one that we bow to and honor and worship, but He's the one that we reach out to and use and get so that He will give us all of the things that we ultimately want more. This is a challenge for us. We have to be very careful. We never want to exchange a good, healthy, godly relationship with Jesus for something else that just uses His name to get something beyond. So a guy comes to me years ago and he says, hey, I think I'm going to start coming to church. I say, that's awesome. Tell me about it. I think I'm going to start coming to church because my wife wants me to come to church. It sounds like you got a good wife. That's good. There you go. What do we do from here? Well, she's going to leave me if I don't go to church. Okay, sounds like you need to go to church. I mean, it sounds like you got this figured out. And he goes, yeah, and so what I need you to do, Brad, is I need you to tell me how to act so that she'll think I'm taking it serious. Let that sink in for just a moment. I said, what do you mean tell you? It's really great that you have this open of a relationship with me, man. I appreciate that. But what do you mean tell you how to act? And he's like, well, how often am I supposed to raise my hand in a song? How often, I mean, is it normal? Do really church guys, do they go, are those the ones that go down to the altar and kneel and pray? Because I really need this to work. I mean, if I don't do this right, then she's going to leave me. And oh my gosh, have you seen her angry? Oh my gosh, you have no idea what I will go through if I don't do this right. So I want you, the pastor, to teach me how to do it right so that she is convinced and sticks around. Now that's, I know that's kind of almost a ludicrous story. It's a true one, believe it or not, but it's almost a ludicrous story. But what this person is saying is, how do I use Jesus to get what I want? And what I want is my wife to stay. That's what I want. How do I use prayer and kneeling and singing and attendance and giving? And he literally asked me, how much money do I have to give so that I look serious? I'm like, that's a great question, brother. And so here's what we want to make sure. We want to make sure that we are following and worship Jesus, not using and devaluing Jesus in order to get something different. And all of us, if we don't watch out, are tempted in our world and in our culture to do that. We never want to exchange. So let's talk about a few things that I think that I and others have exchanged for worshiping Jesus. One might be just a simple substitution. In other words, instead of loving and worshiping Him, there's the other thing that I love and worship, so I'm going to have it instead. Deuteronomy 6 says, do not follow other gods, the gods of the people around you. Would you guys say that phrase out loud? The gods of the people around you. For the Lord your God, who is among you, is a what? Jealous God. Let's talk about that. The idea of the gods of the people around you is so often skipped over. Here's what I mean. I've been in conversations with other Christians and things about false gods and world religions and things. And I even pick on my good friend Brady Weldon. You guys love him and know him, and I love him and know him. One time I got out of the car. You may have heard me say this before. I got out of the car, downtown Paducah. There's this big revival going on, and Brady is, he's full of fire. You know what I mean? He is going. And he's doing such a good job, but then he gets on this little pericope here that I've picked on him about to his face, and he said it's okay for me to tell you that I picked on him about it. He says, Buddha can't save you. And the whole crowd goes nuts. He says, Confucius can't save you. And the whole crowd goes nuts. And he says, Mohammed can't save you. And the whole crowd goes nuts. And I said to my buddy, were there any Islamic people in the room? No. Were there any Buddhists there? No. I'm going to assume no Confucianists then. No. See, that's cool to say those things, but we're supposed to focus on the gods of the people around us. And believe it or not, folks, they don't go by big names and aren't called out as major religions, but America is filled. The southeastern region is filled. Kentucky is filled. Livingston County is filled with things that people treat as gods. Think about it. What is something that if I dedicate my whole self to it, it will make me feel better and help me look better and make me happy? What is something that if I'll just reach out to that, it will finally make me happy? Now, all of these things aren't necessarily gods in themselves. I don't know that they even set out to be gods, and most of them are inanimate objects and don't really have an intention themselves, but we tend to find our way into a world where we use them to be a god, and we fail so badly because they simply aren't. Right? You guys know what I'm talking about, right? If you've ever talked with someone at the end of a brokenness that led to addiction, and they're coming out of that addiction, every one of those folks will tell you, in the beginning, it really did meet my needs. In the beginning, I'm telling you what, in the beginning, like drinking or smoking weed or whatever else I was taking, it really did make me feel better. In the beginning, I absolutely loved it. And if it had been like it was in the beginning forever, I would still be doing it. But the problem is they're not real gods. And so what happens is that the lie is this can make you happy. And then you give yourself to it, and you're caught. You're tricked. You're captured. Same thing's true with money. Money is a god for so many people, right? If not, why would the Bible address it in such ways where God Himself says you can't serve that one or that one? You have to pick one, the real one or the fake one. And I got to tell you, all the time, Christian folks, other folks are living with an intention of trying to find money, have money. I have a buddy. He lives in Alabama. There's a sport in Alabama. They're pretty good at it. They love it when they come to Kentucky because we're honestly not nearly as good at it. And here's something he said to me. He said, Brad, I was reading the book of Psalms. I was reading the book of Psalms about worship, and I noticed a few words that tend to pop up. For instance, in the book of Psalms, you'll find things like clapping, shouting, dancing, and hand lifting. It's all through 150 chapters of Psalms, which is the worship book of the Bible. And his quote to me about living in Alabama was, Saturday's more like Psalms than Sunday. He's like, dude, we get there 4 hours before the game starts and cook lunch and share it with everybody around us. And we're wearing our colors and we're shouting and singing and having all kinds of fun and joy. We're doing all this great stuff, and before you know it, man, then the time is here. And the time is here, and we give ourselves completely and fully. He said, I'm telling you, like my buddies, if their wife calls in the middle of the game and they're at the stadium, they do not answer. If she calls 5 times within 5 minutes, they might answer with a text and go, I'm at the game. And then he looked at me and went, you guys have a sport like that up in your way, don't you? It's not the same one. He reminded me of that regularly. But see, we have to be careful, or we will forget that the things that excite us most, the things that bring us into awe and awe-inspire us, that's the thing we're worshiping, the thing that is most important to us. And there's nothing wrong with having things that you love and enjoy and celebrate. We just have to make sure that it never becomes the most. We don't want to battle against the gods of overseas. We want to deal with spiritually the gods of the people around us and make sure that we don't fall prey to worshiping them. Because our God is what's the word? Jealous. God says, I don't want you to give your devotion to that thing. I want you to give it to me. I don't want you, I appreciate that you're enjoying yourself, but and I love you, but I don't want you to find your enjoyment completely and fully and most in that thing. I want you to find your joy and peace in Him, he says. So we want to make sure we never have a substitution in our life that spiritually becomes the issue. The next thing that we want to make sure we don't have is that we don't have pride. We don't have pride. John 12:42 says, yet at the same time, many even among the leaders believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, so they believed in Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they would not confess their faith for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. For they loved praise from men more than praise from God. We are a contemporary church. We sing with a band, and we sing old songs and new songs and lots of different things. Usually it's pretty peppy and there's lots of energy. Can I tell you the first time I ever went in a church like this? I grew up in a church with a $150,000 pipe organ, and the choir wore robes, and the pastor was in a 3-piece suit, and the Bible was KJV. That's the church I grew up in, okay? Now I was very quick to learn, and God's used me outside of that culture, but when I was probably 21 or 22, Stephanie and I went, believe it or not, on a vacation to Cleveland, Ohio. It was my choice of vacation destinations. It was not my wife's choice of vacation destinations, and it did involve a coon dog. But anyway, we were in Cleveland, Ohio. We were there on a Sunday. I was pastoring at the time New Clover Creek Baptist Church, which is I think the second church I was a senior pastor at. It was called New Clover Creek Baptist Church because the old one had been there so long that it had fallen down, and they built a new building and called it the new one. That's where the name came from. This church predated slavery. You know what I mean? Like this church had been around for a while. And they were kind of set in their ways. We did things. So I thought it'd be awesome to go try something new. So we're in Cleveland, and I start asking people around, like, what's the coolest, hippest, most progressive church in town? I will drive anywhere in Cleveland. We're going to go to a cool church. And we ended up at a church called The Vineyard. Now, The Vineyard is a very well-known group of churches all over the country, and God did a lot of really great things with them, especially in the 80s and 90s. I had never heard of them. I didn't know anything about them at all. I knew New Clover Creek Baptist Church. That's what I knew. And so Stephanie and I got ready, and we drove to the Vineyard, and when we got there, again, I was a lot younger than I am now. This would have been early 90s or mid 90s, and Stephanie and I are there, and they greet us in the parking lot, and they're nice, and that was pretty cool. And we got to specialized parking spot. And then we walked in, and the room was dark. And I'm thinking things like, what, didn't turn the light on? What, did nobody pay the bill? What is wrong with this moment? And then they, like, smoke machines and laser lights and a rock band, and I'm on the second row, and the guy beside me is going like this, and the person beside me is laying flat on the ground, and I am going, these people are nuts. That's what I was thinking. I mean, I was, like, seriously, I was planning my exit. I was like, what in the... I feel for those who attend a progressive church for the first time and they've never seen it before, because I know probably what you're going through. And although I doubt you're going to see some of the things I saw that day very often or ever here, I get that there's a culture shock going on, and there was a huge culture shock for me. We stayed about an hour and a half, and they hadn't even started the sermon yet. You know what I mean? Like, wow. There was a level of excitement there I had not seen before. And although I'm not necessarily endorsing everything I saw there that day, for me, it was a life-altering experience. It kind of shook me to the core and at the same time scared me half to death. That day, I remember thinking, I'm not raising my hands. I'm not tapping my foot. No. I don't know how, but I'm sure that somebody back at Lone Oak First Baptist Church will find out about that, and I will be in trouble for the rest of my life. I'm not doing it. So I didn't. I always kind of wish that I would have. I thought it's my chance. I could have clapped. Right? And I didn't. I stood like, I had the fig leaf, you know, like what they tell every groomsman to do. This is my service right here. That was it. Several years later, I ended up involved in helping plant churches, and I remember for a few years, believe it or not, with people all around me singing these great songs and things. I remember for a few years, I was like, that was it, man. That was as comfortable as I could get. I couldn't. And here's the deal. I'm not saying that this is more holy than this at all. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying to you that this was what was in my heart, but this is what was in my pride. Because I was worried about what's the person behind me, the person beside me, what's the person around me, what's so-and-so going to... They have never seen me do anything like that ever before, and what are they going to think? And again, what I'm saying, this is no more holy than this. I'm not saying this is more worshipful than this. I'm just saying that we don't want to do whatever we do out of trying to please a person instead of trying to please and worship God. In fact, I could say that this could come from pride in the same way that this could come from pride. You could be standing there going, I want people to think I'm worshipful. Psh. You know, that'd be pride-driven as much as this can be. We want to make sure that we're not like the folks in John 12, where the Pharisees' presence and the fear that they had for the Pharisees meant that they were unwilling to say anything about or express themselves as a worshiper of Jesus. It's important for us not to trade that for pride. It's amazing, honestly, how we can be so concerned about what people think and care so little about what God thinks sometimes. It's very, very amazing. The third one is this, and this might be a word that you probably don't use very often, but the word is hedonism. Hedonism is a world philosophy that says joy, peace, and happiness is the ultimate goal. I'm going to do whatever makes me happy. And I think that although nobody in this room would ever say I'm a hedonist, nobody I've ever talked to would have said I'm a hedonist, but I think this might be the one that we're most tempted by. Because what we will do is we'll say, that's what makes me happy. That's what makes me comfortable. That's what I want. That's what I want. It is just what I want. Like, there's no better reason than that. When I remember many times here at this church and others where someone would join the church and I say to them, why are you joining the church? Tell me what you like about this place. And usually the answer is something like, I like it here. It brings me joy. It makes me filled with hope. And those all sound great. Those are great answers, right? Unless ultimately at the core, our own joy and happiness is our God. You see, you'll find out whether or not joy or happiness or this hedonism is someone's goal when they don't get what they want. When I don't get what I want, that's when I have to deal with whether or not I'm worshiping Jesus or something else. It's hard, isn't it? I'm not pointing any fingers. This is hard on me when I don't get what I want in worship or in whatever. It's hard to thank God for the failure that you felt or to thank God for not getting what you desired. It is. But we have to be open to that. See, it says in Hebrews 13, through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a, what's the word? A sacrifice of praise. Now, this blows in the face of what oftentimes happens in contemporary worship. See, if we don't watch out, here's what happens. Churches in the 80s and 90s started doing contemporary styles of worship in order to connect with unchurched people. In order to help try and take the gospel to people who had given up on traditional church, they started doing the kinds of things that we do. And from the beginning, they understood this is about reaching lost people. But then before you know it, we have an entire generation of people who simply like that style. That's just it. And very quickly, what can happen is that it becomes less and less about reaching the lost and more about doing what I want. All right? This is important for us. He says that worship and praise should be a, what's the word? I underlined it for you. Sacrifice. Worship is a sacrifice. Worship means that I give away something of myself. It's not always going to be something that's joyous, and it's not always going to be something that feels so fulfilling. Oftentimes we'll find ourselves sacrificing ourselves to Him in worship. The next one is, and Pastor Chris, this is his word. He made this up from Church of the Highland. It's spectatorism. It's not a real word, but there you go. You see, I referenced someone this week said, sometimes I think church is like watching a UK ball game on television. It's a whole bunch of people who need exercise watching 10 people who need rest. Okay? Man, that can happen in church if we don't watch out. If we don't watch out, you can end up with a large crowd of people who need to do something watching a whole bunch of people who've done a whole lot more than they have to do. You know? And we want to make sure that doesn't ever become who we are. We don't want to spectate. We want to participate. We don't want to sit back and watch. We want to dive in. As part of the church, we don't want to just observe. We want to be included. We want to make sure that we do that. So here's a couple of verses. James 4:8. James 4:8 will teach us this about the Scripture. Sorry, I skipped over that. James 4:8 says this, come close to God, and God will come close to you. Okay, so let me say something that could be more offensive than I mean for it to. And I really don't mean for it to be offensive, okay? Oftentimes, I'll talk to people about their worship, and they will say something like this, and it sounds very Christian. They'll say, I'm just waiting on God. Just waiting on God to come to me. I'm just waiting on God to tell me. I'm just waiting on God to lead me. I'm just waiting on God. And now listen to me. If you're talking about making major decisions in your life, that's a good philosophy. If you're talking about trying to decide something that God wants you to do, that's a great philosophy. The Scripture even says, be still, right? And wait or know that I am God. So there's a sense in which that's a good thing. But when it comes to worship, you and I need to get this right. God has already done what God's going to do. He died for us on a cross, and He gave us eternity. I don't have to wait for God to worship Him. He's already done everything He's going to do. My response is not about what God will do in the future. My response is based on what God has done in the past. So I don't have to wait for God to heal my cancer in order to worship Him. And I don't have to wait for God to provide that job I'm looking for in order for me to worship Him. And I don't have to wait for God to fix my marriage in order to worship Him. And I don't have to wait for God to deal with that relational difficulty before I worship Him, because God's already done far beyond anything I need Him to do in order for me to respond to Him with love and in order for me to respond to Him with worship. You guys got me there? You feeling me? Worship is not something we have to wait on God for. We run to Him. We draw close to Him. We celebrate Him. Hebrews 10:22 says, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith. He's already done all that He has to do to deserve our worship. And so we worship Him. We serve Him. We follow Him. The last thing that is in this kind of leading into the things that we tend to trade or exchange is tradition. Now, we live in 2016, which means the word tradition doesn't mean the same thing as it did in 2000, and it doesn't mean the same thing that it meant in 1980. And it doesn't at all. In fact, there are many churches that have traditions that look new, but they've been around for 30 or 40 years. Okay? And so I'm not just talking about, by the way, when I use the word tradition, I'm not just talking about what we might call traditional church. So although that's true, there are those that are like, I cannot worship unless I have a hymnal. I cannot, or they'll like something weird, like, I cannot worship unless I'm sitting on a mahogany pew. Come on. Come on. I cannot worship. Pastor Brad, I don't like that new song we sang. I just can't worship to it. As if they're at a dance. They're like, I guess it's a decent song, but it's not funky enough. I can't dance to it. Come on, come on, come on. This is important for us. Just because something has worked in our past does not mean that it is our future. I'll give you an example. I think one of the greatest women to ever live on this planet and love Jesus is a woman named Beth Moore. I'm a huge fan. I think her books are awesome. I think her Bible studies are awesome. I really do. I think she's phenomenal. In fact, like if she were here today, I might just hand her the mic and say, what do you got to say, ma'am? Because she's pretty sharp, okay? Now, listen to me. I've met some ladies one time, and they had gone through a really good Beth Moore study. And they had decided that if any woman really loves Jesus, you have to go through a Beth Moore study. That's the only way. It's the only way to be Jesus-like is Beth Moore study. And that became the answer to every question. The answer to every question. Hey guys, we got these young women, met Jesus. We got to find a way to disciple them. Beth Moore study. Okay, well that might not be a bad answer, but let's see if there are any other answers. Does anybody have another answer? Yes, other Beth Moore study. Let's do that one. She's got her whole aisle at Lifeway. I mean, like she's got a bunch. And she deserves it. I'm a big fan, okay? What I'm getting at is this. Just because God used a particular path to bring you to a place of faith does not mean that that is the path that everyone will take. Now, I'm not talking about theological path. Theologically, yes, there's one path. Jesus died on a cross. He redeemed our sin. We trust ourselves to Him and ask for forgiveness, and He redeems us for eternity. That's the only path. I'm not talking about that theological path. I'm saying that, you know what? My life was changed by a Henry Blackaby study. That's good stuff. God did it. And at the same time, I'm not going to make sure everybody else does it. See, that if we don't watch out, that becomes that becomes something we trade in. All of a sudden, we're so holding on to our experiences of the past that we aren't open to what God's doing today. And we miss out. We really do miss out. We want to make sure that we don't do that. Matthew 15:3, Jesus is speaking to them. He replied, "And why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition." He's speaking to Pharisees. He calls them hypocrites. It's an exclamation point. It's a big deal. Isaiah was right, he says, when he prophesied that sometimes people will honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, and their teaching has become nothing but human rules. Now, I'm not in any way claiming that that is a reality here. I am claiming that that is a reality in our country, and we have to be careful that it doesn't ever become one here. We have to be careful. We don't want to trade the Holy Spirit for our past experiences. We don't want to do that. If we do, we will find ourselves in great struggle. Okay? Great struggle. So, there's the things. What I want to talk to you about today, and believe it or not, I'm going to finish soon, but believe it or not, that was my introduction. The question is, what does God really want? If there are things God doesn't want, what does He want? If He doesn't want all of those other things, He doesn't want us to trade in a love relationship for Him for something else, what does He want? And so here's just really quickly, what does God really want? Read this with me. Psalm 58 through 15, a beautiful psalm. This is a prophetic psalm, which means it's written as if it's coming from the words of God Himself. It's not a song to God, it's a song singing the words of God. So He's speaking to us. He says, "I have no complaint about your sacrifices or the burnt offerings you constantly offer." And that's good because God was the one who told him to do it. So He's saying, I'm not upset about the fact that you're doing what I told you to do. That's good. Okay? "But I do not need the bulls from your barns or the goats from your pens." Here's what He's saying. I know I told you to sacrifice bulls and to sacrifice goats. This is obviously thousands of years ago. I know I told you to do that, and you've been doing it, and I'm glad you're doing it, but I ultimately really don't need that. I don't need the bulls. I don't need the goats. He says, I know every bird on the mountains, and I know every animal in the field, and they're all mine. If I were hungry, God says, I would not tell you, because I don't need you to give me any food. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for all the world is mine and everything in it. He says, do I eat the meat of bulls? Do I drink the blood of goats? In other words, the answers of all these things are no. I don't need those things. Then God tells us what He needs. God tells us what He wants. This is really important. This is a good one to memorize. Go back and read again. Psalm 50, verses 13, 14, and 15. He says, make thankfulness your sacrifice to God, and keep the vows you made to the Most High, and call on me when you are in trouble, and I will rescue you, and you will give me glory. I'm going to read that again. God says to the people of Israel and to us, make thankfulness your sacrifice to God, keep the vows you've made to the Most High, and then call on me when you are in trouble, and I will rescue you, and you will give me glory. Worship is giving God something that He doesn't already have. Now listen carefully. Some of you are going, well, He has everything. Well, let's talk about that. He already owns all the cattle. He already owns all the goats. He already owns all the money. He already has all of those things. But what is the one thing He doesn't have? And it's not something that was taken from Him, by the way. It's something that He gave up freely. We call it free will. It's the idea that God released us from His dominance in our sin, and our brokenness meant that my heart is mine now. Until He redeems it, until He does something with it. Worship is taking the thing that He gave me, and it's mine, and He doesn't already have it. Worship is me giving that back to Him. First thing He says is, if you want to be a worshiper, be thankful. And you're like, yes, I will sing the song in church about Thanksgiving. No, that's not what I mean. I'm talking about on tomorrow morning at 5:45 when the sun comes up and it's gorgeous, like for whatever reason sunrises have been here in the last 6 months. It's in those moments that you go, Lord, you are amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And when you have your meals, it's not just that you go, we're Christians. We have to pray before we eat. No. It's about looking at a plate of food going, God gave this to me. He gave this to me. I need to thank Him for that. And it's about taking in a gasp of wonderful, clean air. And in your mind and in your heart, remembering that He gave that to you. It's His gift, thanking Him for it. Living life with thanksgiving as the foundation for who you are. You want to be a worshiper? Then let thankfulness be your biggest expression. You understand what I'm saying? Let me tell you something that I'm learning. This is letting you into my own mess, okay? God's not really looking for the worship of those who don't love Him and don't know Him. So it would do no good, for instance, for us to make someone worship Him, like presently often happens in Muslim countries, where they're attempting to make someone worship their God. It's not worship. Okay? God is looking for the worship of those who know Him. This is how that plays out in my life. Years ago, I made a huge mistake in my philosophy and what I thought about the world. I thought that success meant that you were well respected and well thought of by as many people as possible. And so I actually set out to build this positive reputation where many people would love me and think great things about me, and I would have such a good resume and reputation. And I remember being proud of the fact that I had this many Facebook friends or this many Twitter followers or this many hits on my website. And I remember being proud when someone I didn't know would recognize me. But I've learned something over the past few years. You see, the adoration from a distance of someone that doesn't know you means nothing compared to the adoration and thankfulness of someone close to you. And so when one of my boys comes to me now and gives me a big hug and says, "Thank you for that thing," whatever it was. And that's awesome. I've learned that it's better to have my son look at me and go, "You're the man," than it is to have somebody I don't know and they don't know me, and they can write some article about me being a good this or a good that, and that don't mean anything. But when one of those boys close to me does, it means something. You guys following me here? Here's what I'm getting at. We are the children of God. People who are not the children of God are not going to worship God. And even if they were going to say nice things about God, I don't know that it means that much to God. But when His children thank Him and come to Him and know Him and love Him, it means everything to God. Make thankfulness your sacrifice to God. Keep the vows you made to the Most High. That's the second thing. Keep the vows that you made to Him. In other words, offer Him control of your life. Offer Him control of your life. Make sure that He knows that you care and that you're committed. Romans 12:1 says, this is out of that chapter we read earlier, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your time and proper worship." I want to read again what I read to you earlier. Make thankfulness your sacrifice to God. Keep the vows that you've made to the Most High and call on Him when you're in trouble. We're in that middle section, keeping the vows. Listen, there are some of us in this room, not because I'm pointing anybody or thinking anybody, but I could be in any room in America. Okay? There's some of us in this room who struggle with keeping their word, struggle with following through with their commitments, struggling with doing what they said they were going to do. And in the process, here's what happens. I'm just going to speak to my generation and younger. A lot of times, you guys know what I'm talking about. I'm not picking on anybody. A lot of times when a 25-year-old says, "I'll be there," what they really mean is, "I'll be there unless something better comes along." A lot of times that's what they mean. A lot of times, gals, if a guy asks you out, he means, "Yes, we will go out, unless a prettier gal wants to go out with me. And I'll go out with her." And this is important that you get this. It's not everybody. I don't mean all people. I just mean sometimes. But we're trying to build worshipers. And worshipers are people who make commitments to God and then do everything they can to keep those commitments. Worshipers are people who look to God and see direction from God and do everything they can to follow it. And so our worship shows up in our commitment. At the same time, on the flip side of that same story, if we don't watch out, keeping our word and fulfilling our commitments becomes something other than worship. Because we've done it so well and we've done it so long that we end up if we don't watch out, we end up proud of ourselves for having done it. And it actually can become the enemy of our worship because we're worshiping our own committedness instead of the one to whom we are committed. We want to make sure that we keep our vows to the Lord and recognize that we're following Him because He gave His life for us. The last thing, and I'm done, is this. We want to learn to call to Him when we are in trouble. You see, Baptists, we get this one wrong. We talk about confession as if it's some sort of courtroom detail. Like confessing to God as if He's a police officer and we're in trouble. Confessing to God is as if He's a judge and we're in trouble. And that's not really the metaphor for confession that we see in the New Testament especially, and this comes from the Psalms. God is saying, when you're in trouble, you need to tell me because I'm going to help you. When you're broken, you need to tell me. I want to help you. When you're struggling, you need to reach out to me. I'm there. I want to help you. And so if you found yourself in sin, tell me. If you found yourself hurting, tell me. If you found yourself depressed, tell me. If you found yourself, angry, tell me. Because I want to, what's the word? I didn't underline it this time. It's tricky. I want to rescue you. Believe it or not, one of the top 3 things you can do to worship God is to tell God you disobeyed God. One of the top things that you can do to worship God is to tell God that you failed God. One of the top things that you can do to worship God is to tell God that you need God. One of the top things that you can do to worship God is to be vulnerable before God instead of trying to look strong in front of Him. Make faithfulness your sacrifice to God and keep the vows you made to the Most High. Then call on me when you are in trouble, and I will rescue you, and you will give me glory. That's worship. That's worship. We want to include Him in every area of our life and call to Him when we have struggles. Would you pray with me?